Detective stories and murder mysteries all explore our fascination with crime and its repercussions. We are drawn to these stories because they probe the boundaries of human behavior. We want to see, but then again, we don't. We've all heard that truth is stranger than fiction, but when it comes to real-life murder, the twisted imagination of a killer can trump any fictional story. The corkscrew, a harmless implement used to open a bottle of wine, commonly found in a kitchen drawer in almost every home. But you don't expect to find one sticking out of a human body. Carlos Castro was a 65-year-old Portuguese reality television star and acclaimed journalist and was loving life. In 2011, his body was found in a New York hotel. Carlos had been badly beaten, strangled, and mutilated with a collection of bizarre weapons: a computer monitor, a wine bottle, and a corkscrew. Investigators soon settled on a prime suspect, Renato Seabra, Carlos's 23-year-old lover. The jury and court attendants were told in horrific detail everything Renato allegedly did. In a frenzied attack, Renato bludgeoned and strangled Carlos to death, afterwards castrating him with a corkscrew, wearing the amputated flesh as a bracelet, and drinking Carlos's blood. Renato's defense lawyers argued that he was not of sound mind and could not be held responsible for his actions, but prosecutors argued that because Renato placed a "Do Not Disturb" sign on the hotel room door after the act, he showed presence of mind, and for that the jury found him guilty of murder. Renato Seabra is currently serving a 25-year sentence for his crimes. Carlos Castro's ashes were scattered by his sister in the subway tunnels under Broadway, a place he frequented and loved. The eyes are the windows to the soul. Psychologists argue that we are hardwired from birth to fixate on them, to value someone's gaze, and to avoid it when being submissive. But it's one thing to be captivated by beautiful eyes, and another to collect them. Charles Albright was dubbed the eyeball killer by the press, and it's easy to see why. After carrying out crimes such as forgery and child molestation, from the 1960s onwards, he began collecting the eyes of his victims. An unusually bright child, Albright spent much of his time shooting animals and then preserving them to be stuffed and displayed, but he couldn't afford the glass eyes needed to add a lifelike finishing touch. Perhaps this is where the obsession began, but it wasn't until the early 1990s that his obsession turned to madness. Albright shot his first victim, Mary Lou Pratt, a 33-year-old prostitute living in Dallas, in the back of the head, before removing both of her eyes with surgical precision. 3 months later, in February 1991, Albright struck again, killing another prostitute named Susan Peterson. Her eyes had been removed just like Mary Lou Pratt's had. Curiously, Susan allegedly claimed to know who the eyeball killer was before she was brutally silenced. Albright's final victim, Shirley Williams, was found dead near a school, beaten more savagely than the others as his violence escalated. Albright kept his victims' eyes as tokens, much like he had done with the bodies of animals when he was a child. Thankfully, he was caught before he could harm anyone else, although he insists to this day that he is innocent, and the real eyeball killer is still out there. It seemed like a simple plan: kidnap someone rich, stow them underground alive, and wait for the ransom to be paid. What could possibly go wrong? Stephen Small, a successful businessman in Kankakee, Illinois, had much to live for. He had money, was a successful entrepreneur, and lived a good life. But success can attract unwanted attention from those wishing to profit from misery. Just after midnight on September 2nd, 1987, Stephen Small was kidnapped by Danny Edwards and Nancy Risch. who were posing as police officers and told Stephen one of his properties had been broken into. After this, the plan was simple: contact Stephen Small's wife and demand a $1 million ransom for his return, or they would kill him. The kidnappers placed Stephen into a wooden coffin and gave him food, a jug of water, and a flashlight before burying the coffin in the ground. A pipe led from the coffin to the air above so that Stephen would have enough oxygen to breathe, but the kidnappers didn't realize that the pipe wasn't big enough to provide adequate oxygen. After tracing Edwards and Rish's ransom calls, the police arrested both of them and were eventually led to the makeshift coffin. Inside was Stephen Small's lifeless body. He had died in agony, his lungs slowly starved of oxygen until he suffocated. Rish and Edwards were found guilty of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Both are still behind bars to this very day for their failed plan that had deadly consequences. Since the 1950s, the term nuclear age has conjured fear. Between a nuclear war, faulty submarines poisoning the sea, or accidents like Fukushima and Chernobyl, radioactive waste is widely perceived as a threat. But it only takes the smallest drop of radioactive material to lead to a bitterly painful, incurable end. The poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko was brutal. It was a case of shadowed assassins waiting to strike at any moment, and it caused a major diplomatic stir. Once a Russian agent, Alexander was granted asylum in the United Kingdom after allegedly being pursued by the Russian government. After publishing a series of damning books accusing the Russian government of ordering the death of political adversaries, Alexander fell ill with a mysterious sickness after meeting with two former KGB officers. At first, the symptoms resembled food poisoning or a bad gastric flu, but his condition deteriorated quickly. He found it difficult to walk and was finally admitted to the hospital. There, the doctors could find no common reason for the illness until his blood and urine tests revealed he'd been poisoned with radioactive material. But it was too late, and his dose was fatal. Before his death, Alexander pointed the finger directly at the Russian government for his sickness. He died of heart failure on the 22nd of November 2006, 21 days after he was poisoned. UK investigators found the source of the radiation originated from a nuclear power plant in Russia, although Russia denies all involvement. What we do know is that Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned and paid for expressing his opinions with his life. Retirement should be about happiness, a chapter in life that releases a person from the stresses of work and financial commitments. But for Marianne Soir and her brother Horace, retirement proved to be something entirely different, a once happy journey that took a turn into utter misery. 87-year-old Marianne Soir was well liked in her community of Lancaster, Pennsylvania. She lived in an old townhouse that belonged to her parents before her. She lived quietly and happily with her 81-year-old brother Horace, an electrician, and was always a friendly face to neighbors. Then, at approximately midnight on Monday, September 10th, everything changed. 4 men forced their way into Mary and Horace's home and robbed them of all their valuable possessions, but did far worse. The men bound and gagged Mary and Horace and left them there in the night. They could not see, shout for help, or even move. All they could do was lie in the darkness and wait for help, but no one came. They were left there in their house without food or water for a week. When the newspapers started piling up, the delivery man raised concerns to the authorities. Police entered the house and found Mary still tied up and blindfolded, dead from thirst. Horace was barely breathing and later passed away in the hospital. 10 years later, after an anonymous tip, 3 men were eventually arrested, tried, and found guilty of the crime. John Arthur Askew, George Burkhart, and Dale Healy. They are still in prison today. The 4th man, Robert O'Neill, who knew about the robbery but never entered the house, was given a reduced sentence for cooperating with the authorities. This case is made all the more disturbing knowing how different the outcome could have been. Local police received an anonymous call the day after the robbery. and were informed that 2 people were bound and gagged at a house in Lancaster. Unfortunately, the caller gave the wrong house number. That's all for now. If you'd like to help fight to keep creepy and true crime content on YouTube, please consider giving anything at all to my Patreon, linked in the description below. It would be a tremendous help. Let's keep YouTube creepy. Thanks for listening. Also, be sure to check out another one of my videos, and of course press on screen now to subscribe to my channel, because you won't want to miss what's next. And I'll see you next time.